When most people talk about defence procurement, they start with the machinery. They begin with the governance, the approval gates, the programs, the documents, the frameworks, and the acronyms. It creates the impression that the system is driven by process alone. But if you look closely, you soon realise the system is actually driven by people who are carrying very different kinds of weight. And those weights shape far more than any flowchart ever will. A political director may be carrying the weight of public trust, knowing that a single misstep lands in the national press. A military officer is carrying the weight of real consequence because an assumption made in a meeting room can become a risk to life in another country. A commercial lead carries the weight of audit and scrutiny, where a decision made quickly today may be questioned meticulously 6 months from now. Technical authorities carry the weight of physics and safety, where no amount of ambition can bend the limits that govern reliable performance. And then there are companies, especially the smaller ones, who are carrying the weight of existential survival every time they invest in a bid. These are not abstract incentives. They are human burdens. And when you see defence through that lens, you start to understand why people act the way they do and why the system behaves the way it does. That is the foundation for everything else I'm about to explain in the second episode of the Prism Pod. There is a truth at the heart of defence that rarely gets said clearly, yet it explains almost everything. Defence does not buy technology. It buys a reduction in consequence. Political teams are trying to reduce political consequence. Military users are trying to reduce operational consequence. Commercial teams are trying to reduce approvals and financial consequence. And technical teams are trying to reduce safety and physics consequence. When you understand that every group is optimizing to reduce a different form of consequence, the entire behavior of the system changes shape. What looks like slowness is often caution. What looks like risk aversion is often responsibility. And what looks like bureaucracy is often an attempt to make a decision defensible in a world where the cost of getting it wrong is significant. This shift in perspective is the first major unlock. Once you understand that the primary driver is consequence, not capability, the whole system becomes more legible. One of the deepest structural truths in defence is that the real decision maker is almost never the person sat across the table from you. A program manager may appear to be the one driving the choice, but often they are guided by the constraints that sit behind them. Sometimes the constraints are safety. Sometimes it's integration with legacy systems. Sometimes it is political heat, and other times it's affordability. Sometimes it's simply that the physics of the problem does not give the freedom the industry assumes they have. This is why a program can be green on a dashboard yet still feel fragile. It's why capability can pass a milestone and still be paused. It is why a requirement can be agreed on paper, then altered as soon as it is examined through a different dialect inside the system. We've seen a hint of this with Ajax. The vehicle was declared to have achieved an important milestone, yet almost immediately, training was paused because a deeper constraint, in this case safety, reasserted itself. That is not indecision, that is not dysfunction, that is simply the strongest constraint in the system taking priority, as it always will, and it not being understood equally amongst all the different stakeholders involved with the process beforehand. Once you understand that constraints drive decisions more than titles, you begin to see defence as predictable rather than confusing. Another reason industry struggles is that defence does not speak a single language. It speaks 4 dialects, each shaped by the type of consequence a group is trying to avoid. The political dialect focuses on optics, accountability, and strategic embarrassment. The military dialect focuses on outcomes, integration, and what happens in reality, not theory. The commercial dialect cares about approvals, affordability, and auditability. The technical dialect lives within the physics of the system and the safety of the people who use it. These dialects rarely align. What feels acceptable to one can feel irresponsible to another. What seems ambitious to one can seem unsafe to another. And when industry turns up speaking a 5th dialect centered on capability, differentiation, and potential, it often fails to land because it has not spoken to the underlying burden of consequences that each group carries. That is why communication breaks down. It is not because people are difficult, it is because they are speaking different languages shaped by different risks. Almost every conversation between defence and industry is filled with good intent. Industry genuinely believes in its solution. Defence genuinely wants improvement. Yet the interaction still fails. And the reason is simple. Industry is trying to prove capability. Defence is trying to manage consequence. These are not opposing goals, but they are different enough that they pull the conversation in different directions unless someone deliberately bridges the gap. When industry is unsure what defence wants, it becomes optimistic because optimism is the only tool available to create momentum. When defence is unsure how to interpret industry, it becomes silent because silence is the safest way to avoid something that is uncertain. Industry hears silence and assumes rejection. Defence hears optimism and assumes risk. Both are wrong. Both are acting sensibly inside their own incentive structure, and both misunderstand the other. The misinterpretation is the translation problem, and unless you name it, you cannot solve it. There are moments when the human reality behind these abstract ideas become visible. It might be a capability that looks impressive on paper, but creates unexpected vibration or noise when soldiers actually use it. It might be a training halt, a safety investigation, or a difficult decision about whether a program could proceed. These moments show that consequence is not theoretical, it is physical and human. And they remind us that safety is not a bullet point. In those moments, the system responds in a way that might seem abrupt from the outside, but that make complete sense once you understand that the strongest constraints always take over. This is not a weakness, it is a responsibility of the system. So what should companies do? How do you actually make progress in a system shaped this heavily by consequence? There is one idea that I think sits above the rest. The fastest way to make progress in defence is to collapse the distance between what your system does and how defence makes decisions. When you do that, momentum increases. When you do not, friction becomes inevitable. Here is what collapsing this distance looks like. You must move from a narrative of potential to a narrative of consequence. Explain the problem you reduce, the trade-offs you accept, the physics you respect, the evidence you already have, and the operational effects you produce. You need to describe how your system behaves inside defence's actual decision-making architecture, not just how it behaves in isolation. When you frame your capability through consequence rather than upside, you begin speaking defence's internal language. And to operate effectively in defense, companies need to learn to read the signals properly. What does political caution sound like? What does military intent truly mean? What does commercial risk indicate about the shape of a requirement? And what does a technical constraint reveal about what is and is not possible? When you learn to interpret these signals, silence no longer feels like rejection. Optimism no longer feels like progress. You stop guessing what defence wants and begin understanding the structural pressures shaping its choice. This is a huge unlock. It allows you to aim your effort at the real target rather than the imagined one. This is where translation becomes practical. You need to create a version of your pitch in each defence dialect. You have to do this. A customer will only ever speak about your product in the words that you provide, so doing this is critical to ensuring that your capability is represented in the correct way internal to the customer's dialogue. Write a trade-off statement that openly describes where your system weakens or what conditions it prefers. Build a defence fit one-pager that lays out compliance, assumptions, evidence, and interoperability in a way that defence can digest quickly. Ask questions that reveal structure, such as what outcome is being optimised for, and what risks carry the most weight, and which constraints has shaped the requirement more strongly. These actions immediately reduce uncertainty, and when uncertainty falls, defence feels safer engaging. That safety will create the momentum you crave as a company within defence. Everyone in this system is carrying weight. Industry carries the weight of survival. Military users carry the weight of real consequence. Commercial teams carry the weight of scrutiny. And technical authorities carry the weight of physics and safety. Political teams carry the weight of public trust. These weights are rarely visible to one another, but they define how people act. Translation is the way those weights are shared rather than pushed against one another. It is how capability and consequence are brought into alignment. It is how both sides move past misinterpretation and towards clarity. And it is how the system avoids repeating the same painful lessons we find ourselves suffering from over and over again. Defense does not lack technology, it lacks alignment. The companies that learn to bridge that gap will be the ones that the system learns to trust for the longest. Not because they shouted the loudest, but because they understood the people who hold the system together. When you understand that, everything begins to move.